Premier Alan Winde's 16th Energy Digicon. Special guest for this edition of the weekly Digicon, Professor Anton Eberhard, Energy Policy and Investment Specialist at UCT's and head of the Future Powers Lab at the University of Cape Town's Graduate School of Business. A very warm welcome to you, Professor, and of course, the Premier and our Special Advisor on Energy at the Western Cape Government, Mr. Alvie Lester. Today we are asking some very critical questions as the country once again slips into stage 6 load shedding after what has been a slight reprieve from the higher stages of load shedding. So that'll be one of the questions that we'll be posing to our panel. Why are we seeing this sudden slip into high stages of load shedding? But the other questions we're asking as well is, what does the future power landscape of South Africa look like? What will a new look, if we can put it like that, Eskom look like? Will it in fact, in the future, in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, be a part of the country's energy landscape and climate? And we'll be focusing on those aspects. But of course, with every Digicon, it is open to all kinds of questions related to the energy crisis and the solutions that we are coming up with, whether it be at the Western Cape Government or in the private sector, to alleviate and eventually end these rolling blackouts. So without further ado, let's move on to the housekeeping rules. For those of you joining us for the first time, if I could just ask you all outside of the Digicon to please keep your cameras and your microphones off. I will indicate when we reach the point of the Digicon where we will start taking questions for the panel. You can pose those questions in the chat box. You can WhatsApp them to me as well. You can, of course, also raise them on the Premier's various social media platforms, or you can do it the old-fashioned way. You can email me and we'll pose those questions at that point. But here we go. As we get the 16th Energy Digicon underway, I'd like to hand over to the Premier. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Regan. And just looking at that picture with the bright sunlight shining on me through that curtain. Maybe someone can fix that. But thank you very much and welcome to this Digicon. And Prof, thank you very much for joining us. And of course, Mr. Lester, we'll hear from him shortly. But looking at me, you can see that I am absolutely fully charged. My batteries are charged. And why is that? Because last week, my wife and I took a little bit of a road trip and I took a break and charged my batteries. I went out into the rural parts of our province, the most beautiful province in the world. And the most amazing thing for me is the places that we booked, the Airbnb places or these rural places in our nature reserves, etc. The most amazing thing for me is they were all off the grid, bar the last place, which was a hotel in the West Coast region of our province. And when you get to some place that is off the grid with its solar panels and its battery systems, it's amazing how quickly you forget about load shedding. And I remember getting to this hotel at the last few days stay of the break, and within hours of arriving at the hotel went into a load shedding period where candles came out and excuses, etc. And of course, you've got to engage with foreign visitors and let them know what this strange phenomenon is called load shedding. But that's why we're holding this Digicon, because it's about how are we going to transition and what are those benefits and how do we help indigent households. And those are all the things that we've been speaking about over time. When do we get a first town in our province to be load shedding free? What are the new investments? How are we engaging nationally, internationally? And where do the opportunities lie? I want to leave you as the citizens, the media, probably with just 2 points. The first is, are we creating and do we have the right skills for this future energy transition that we are all involved in, and we're right in the middle of it right now? And I want to say I don't think we do. And it's so great to have the professor here from a university who also needs to be part of producing those skills for the future. I've just come from a meeting with Sasol, the Saldanha Bay IDZ, ArcelorMittal. They already have signed an agreement, and we're looking at how Saldanha Bay, the Western Cape, the Northern Cape, and Namibia can play a role in green hydrogen not only for export, but also as a source of renewable fuels for the future into the region. The big thing for me is, do we have the right skills for this space? And if I look at the world map of the future prospects of green hydrogen, I see big work happening across the planet, everywhere. Everyone seems to be focusing on green hydrogen. We've got to make sure that we are understanding what those future skills are for this space, and are those skills being produced right now? Are learners in our education system who are making decisions on their subject choices at school level aligning themselves, if they are so inclined to think of themselves as a solar technician or a high voltage electrical engineer or everything in between, and probably some jobs that we don't even know exist yet, but it's that kind of field. And so that really is something that I want to leave all of us, is that this is a fast changing world, and we need to make sure we've got the right skills development going in to the future. And I think existing companies who are working many, many hours beyond normal days because of the demand, and you can see that when you speak to them, they're needing more electricians, they're needing more specialists in specifically green energy. And I get exactly the same thing from our municipalities, who are busy trying to enable this new world, which they've never been enabling before. They've been stuck in an old paradigm, buying power and then selling it to you, the customer, and making a profit. And of course, that model is changing now as well. So yeah, it's great to be holding this Digicon. There are always a lot of questions, but there are also some great presentations and some answers. And I presume I'm going to hand straight over to Alvi Lester, who will just give us an update on where we are, and perhaps also start to answer some of those questions about, we all felt quite relaxed at level 1s and 2s, and suddenly we're back at 6. Alvi, over to you.
Thank you very much, Premier, and welcome to the colleagues, Professor Eberhard, the media, and everyone that's dialed in on the Digicon. So before I bring up the presentation, maybe just some quick responses. I think firstly, Premier, 100% correct. I think there's a huge shift, and it has been over the last few years in terms of the energy space, and I'm sure that Professor Eberhard will share quite a bit on that as well. And definitely there is a skills gap that's being created. I think we've just gone through a skills audit in the province. I think we're very conscious that in the new energy or emerging energy market, that there is quite a big skills gap that we need to close, and we need to start engaging with the likes of tertiary education facilities around how do we close that gap, and how do we close that, particularly in the medium and long term. Just from a business perspective, I think in the last 2 weeks, people have, I think I've had quite a bit of contact with people in terms of, what has happened? Why is it that we see this reprieve? Is it sustainable? Should they be putting their plans aside in terms of their own resilience, their own sort of alternatives? Is Eskom back on track? How are things going? And again, I think between my feedback and probably the more detailed stuff from Professor Eberhard, we'll probably get a good idea of what exactly is happening. But just on our own program, colleagues, I want to just highlight again, just so we keep our eye on the target, we still plan to get to our 2035 target. Just in terms of our programs, I think we're starting to see some good traction. Last week, we went to the market on items within the load shedding relief program. And I think by the end of this month, we'll probably, from a commercial perspective, start to see some movement in terms of those load shedding relief projects that we're looking at. Our provincial RP, I want to also comment and say that, again, progress. We've concluded an agreement between ourselves and some international funders for us to be able to look at the provincial RP. So that's quite positive. I think we'll probably also again go to market and start talking about having a tangible plan in place in the next 6 to 12 months as well. On the demand side management program, we're having an indaba at the end of this month between ourselves, the City of Cape Town, as well as Eskom in the province. I think just to get an understanding of what role each one of us will play in demand side management in the province. And I think this will shape largely the sort of scopes for the, for the 3 entities in the province in terms of our activities in demand side management. There's been a lot of activity on the new energy generation program. We've seen that George is ready to go to market in terms of an IPP. Stellenbosch, we literally on the brink of taking Stellenbosch to the market. The city's been out twice, so the city's making quite a bit of progress on their dispatchable energy tender that they've gone out. And then there's a lot of work taking place in the other pioneering municipalities for us to start looking at what projects we want to take to the market, specifically focus on the Saldanha space, and because of the green hydrogen opportunity that we see there. So we'd like to start moving on getting Saldanha ready to go to the market as well. On the network development program, also quite a bit of headway. We've also just seen the latest announcement where Eskom has been given funding from USAID to the tune of about $1.2 million for transmission upgrades. I think part of our discussion with the ambassador, the ambassador from the EU, was to talk about what activities can we unlock within the transmission grid that will create more megawatts on the system, but also start to talk about unlocking some of the distribution network. But just from a energy availability, yes, the last week, I think we've seen an improved energy availability factor. At the end of the week, we were sitting at about 58%. We were hovering quite close to 60% in the last few days. And there's a number of factors that contributed to that. I think clearly the winter outage plan is contributed to that. There's less maintenance that takes place in the winter. What you also find is that certainly some of the big customers, the smelters, the mines, etc., they plan their own maintenance over this period. And it's because there's a different pricing mechanism. Eskom has a winter tariff and a summer tariff. And so the winter tariff is quite expensive. It's a pricing signal that they send to customers. So the bigger customers tend to plan their outages over the winter period. And so you see a slow introduction, but you also see an opportunity then for more energy to be available. On the unplanned outage factor, and you can see this has sort of stayed roughly about the same. About 32% of that is exactly where it was at. And what it really means is that there hasn't been any additional unplanned outages other than the ones that they've factored in. And also, it's relatively the same over the last few weeks and days, that the same plant or the amount of energy available from those different plants has stayed about the same. I think the significant difference we've seen between a few days ago and yesterday and going forward is that you've seen quite a bit of breakdown in some of the generation plant over the last 2 days again. And so again, the system, very volatile. The fixes that we've seen, not entirely sustainable. And so it makes it very difficult for us to get a sort of reliability factor in terms of there will be X amount of megawatts available and the energy availability factor will be X. So I think the variables are quite difficult to manage. But at the same time, I think we've got historic data that shows that this is and has been the case for some time. So I'm not expecting that we're going to see massive improvements in the energy availability factor. I think, again, the EAF improvement is vastly due to the fact that you've got lower maintenance taking place and you've got a lower demand on the system as well. Just from the outlook for the week ahead, if I look at the week of the 14th of July, in terms of the optimistic view, I think when the original plan was done, the optimistic view was in this particular week, we should see almost no load shedding. And you'll see that second last column is yellow, but that was the optimistic view. I think the very last column is a lot more of the realistic view of what's going to happen. And we've seen it already. We've gone from stages 1, 2, straight back into 4 and 6. So I expect next week we'll probably find ourselves in stage 4 again. Yes, of course, the cold spell has obviously added to the issue across the country. But again, I think we would have been in at least stage 4 given the energy availability and the sort of reliance of some of the plant. So just in summary, again, we are still below, what the average was for last year in terms of energy availability. I think the operating margins, we sort of swinging in between, not having the full operating reserve available and then having the full amount available. I think the EAF, again, also, the target has been set for 60%. I think we need to just understand what exactly contributes to that 60%. Are we seeing a sustainable return of plant, or are we seeing, just lower demand, lower maintenance, and increased use of other sources of energy, as opposed to the plant on outage coming back and staying in service? So again, I think for the next few weeks, we're probably going to find quite a bit of movement in the EAF, but I don't see that we will see a permanent swing towards the 60%. So Premier, yeah, that's my sort of view of what's happened and what the outlook is going to be like going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alvi. And as always, always nice to see that clarity, but also know that we've got this vision. We know where we want to go. It's not an easy fix. It's going to take time, but we need to make sure we get to that 5,700 megawatt target, because that's going to give us that energy sustainability going forward. And of course, all the other benefits that are going to come with it. But now we're going to move over to Prof. Eberhard. Thank you very much for joining us on this Digicon. Over the last years, I always really listen when you are on a radio program or on some of those energy platforms, because you bring such clarity and such wisdom, but also because you represent or come from a space which, as I said earlier, is a university developing not only the research and understanding of where we are, but also the future. And I mean, there's some amazing programs that are happening that I did visit the other day around some new fuels being designed, etc. But if we don't partner correctly with our universities, if we don't make sure that we enable the knowledge and the brains trust within the region to help affect our changes, our decisions. When I say our decisions, I'm talking about government, I'm talking about private sector, I'm talking about investors into the energy space. And of course, at the end of the day, users. And it's the users at the moment of electricity that really feel the brunt of the lack of maintenance and investment, etc. But Prof, it's really good to have you here. And if I can hand over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Premier, and good morning, everyone. Let me start by just reinforcing something that Alvi was saying around how is it that after a number of weeks of having lower load shedding, we are now moving into stage 4 and stage 6. Just the next slide, please. So let's remind ourselves why the Eskom system operator institutes load shedding. Essentially, it's to get the demand and supply in balance, to protect the system and prevent a grid collapse. And as Alvi has said, on the demand side, we've seen slightly lower demand in recent weeks, with the big energy-intensive users taking off their plant for maintenance as the winter tariffs come in. We've seen also a very significant contribution from wind energy, around 2 gigawatts. So that's almost equivalent to 2 stages of load shedding. And what that means is that the residual demand that Eskom has to meet is then lower. Same effect with distributed solar, which is also making an impact. And then on the supply side, as Alvi said, in winter, typically they take less plant off for maintenance, so there's greater availability of plant. And also the winter temperatures are lower, so you get better thermal efficiencies, and so you get lower partial load losses. All of this contributes to more availability. And then Eskom has been burning its diesel units very extensively. They say up to 30 billion rand will be spent this year. I think it's unbudgeted, so it'll be interesting to see where that comes from. So what's changed over the last week? As Albi says, cold weather in Gauteng, we've had slightly higher demand on the one side, and on the supply side, Eskom breakages have increased somewhat. So the supply has gone down and the demand's gone up, and so more load shedding. What does the immediate future look like? I think we're in for a tough winter, but some respite towards the end of the year. So some of these big Kusile units that are being repaired will come back in December, and that will make a big difference. And some more Kusile and Vujip units next year. So the next slide again, please. Looks like there's a bit of delay in this. So the other question I've been asked quite frequently recently, what's happening at Koeberg? So we know Koeberg was built in the 80s. It's a 40-year design life. That expires, and its license expires in July next year. And if they want to continue and they want to extend that another 20 years, they're going to have to replace a lot of equipment, particularly these very large steam generators. You can see one being delivered to Koeberg there. And that work started, but it's way over time. Deadlines are being missed. Unit 1 was supposed to be complete now in July. It's extended into August, and I think the latest date is now mid-October. And then when Unit 1 is finished, Unit 2 will have to go off, also for an extended outage to refurbish its equipment. So for the next foreseeable future, at least one of Koeberg's units is going to be offline. That's 920 megawatts, almost equivalent to one stage of load shedding, and it's going to make a significant difference. Next slide, please. So I think to really understand what's happening at Eskom, it's not so much these short-term issues of, do we get more load shedding or less load shedding from week to week? It's the long-term trend that is very significant. And that chart on the left, you can see, is the average energy availability factor of Eskom's fleet, and it declined from 90% in 2000 over a 20-year period to it dropped around 20%. And then you can see very significant precipitous decline in recent years. And the impact of that has been more load shedding. So we saw load shedding initially in 2007 and 8, again in 2014 and 15, and then every year since 2018, and it's got worse each year. This year already we have more load shedding than we had in the entire year last year. Okay, we just have this delay, unfortunately, in the slides, but it will come through. So this is the first big issue in Eskom. It doesn't have enough capacity, and that capacity is unreliable. The next question, the next big issue is that power is dirty. Most of it is from coal, 84%. And so South Africa has a disproportionate contribution to climate change through carbon dioxide emissions. We're the 32nd biggest economy in the world, but we rank 4th in per capita CO2 emissions. And we're going to be faced with increasing international pressure on our exports. We'll have carbon border adjustment mechanism, which will penalize our exports and make us less competitive going forward. And then the third issue here for Eskom is its financial sustainability. So it is technically insolvent, despite these huge price increases you can see in recent years, both in real and nominal terms. It still needs government bailouts, and it's had bailouts of some 220 billion rand now over the last few years. So Eskom recognizes this issue. It recognizes that it has an outdated business model. It has huge levels of debt. It's not earning enough revenue. In fact, each year it sells less electricity. It's not earning, its costs are high, and so the business model has to change. So what is government doing about this now? The president has set up this National Electricity Crisis Committee that is being supported by business, 10 work streams, and they're working in these 5 outcome areas. They want to fix Eskom, sorry, could you just go back there? They want to fix Eskom is obviously the first priority. The second priority is to for government to be procuring more power, mainly through the IPP office. The third one is freeing up the regulatory space for businesses to be investing in their own solutions, and this is where we're seeing the most progress. Fourth area there is rooftop solar, freeing up that space, and the Western Cape and Cape Town itself are taking the lead around this. Consumers being able to sell electricity back to the grid. And then the fifth area is around restructuring Eskom, which we'll speak about a little bit more in a moment. So what government's about to do is to move from the existing industry structure where we have vertically integrated Eskom, and that's on the left there, generation, transmission, and distribution all in one company. But the next step would be to take out transmission as a subsidiary company. You see the NTC there, National Transmission Company, but still reporting to Eskom Holdings. The final move will be to create an ETSMO, an independent transmission system and market operator. And this step is absolutely critical. Outside of Eskom, so you create the platform for private investment to be coming into the sector. Of course, there's a conflict of interest with Eskom, a generator and also a transmitter, so you need this independent platform. We also need a lot more investment into transmission, and having a separate company from Eskom will enable that. But one of these electricity sources going forward, coal is going to be declining as we go forward. It becomes more expensive, more difficult to finance, and most of the new sources are going to be solar and wind going forward. The cheapest sources and huge investments needed in that 50 to 60 gigawatts by 2030, supported of course by storage, by gas, to ensure that we have a secure system going forward. And what's incredibly positive is that we are seeing a huge response from the private sector. There was a recent survey that was released by the industry and by Eskom itself, and you can see that some 66,000 megawatts of projects are currently being developed around the country. Not all of these will make their way through the various stages of permitting, etc., but encouraging that I think we are seeing the private sector response. And of course, South Africa is not uniquely in this energy transition. This is a global phenomenon, and we're at a tipping point. It's not always clear and easy to see that we're in that tipping point. I mean, we look at 2020 there, it's mostly coal and gas and hydro, etc. But the proportion of solar and wind on the system is going to increase enormously. So we're seeing unprecedented innovation. I always tell my students I've seen more innovation in the sector in the last 7 years than I've seen in 35 years in this business. And it's not just solar and wind coming in, and they're distributed by nature, right? So they a lot more smaller projects, consumers being able to invest in their own supply. So consumers become producers, prosumers, we call them. And then all these innovations in IT, in control technologies, AI, blockchain, big data, etc., are going to make it possible to organize our electricity system in a very different way, with much more private sector participation, much more consumer participation. So an exciting future going forward. And then just to summarize, if we're going to move beyond load shedding, we're going to have to add new investment at a rate faster than Eskom is failing. I think this is an important way to think about it. Eskom's performance is declining. If we're going to have a secure future, we need to accelerate investment at a faster rate. It's a huge amount. We estimate R1 trillion needs to be invested in new generation by 2030. And of course, no one now needs a license to produce electricity, right? The minister and the regulator are no longer gatekeepers to the market, and this has been a major regulatory reform. We still need some streamlining of the permitting processes, but we're getting there. So electricity consumers will increasingly invest in their own solutions, behind the meter, better generation, these direct agreements with IPP. So example in Cape Town would be Amazon. It's contracted a solar plant in the Northern Cape, wheels electricity across the Eskom grid, a perfect solution for a company that's wanting to go 100% renewables by 2025. And then that third area, participation in electricity trading power market. So as we see the transmission come out, we will see the beginning of a power market, a power exchange, and exciting opportunities. And I mean, why I'm particularly pleased to be here today is the Western Cape really is leading the way in terms of procurements. We heard from Alvi there, City of Cape Town, George, Stellenbosch, and others doing this now, investing in improving supply security. Another important impact is going to be dampening the price increases. We saw where the Eskom prices are going, 18% increase this year. These other technologies will come in at lower cost. And of course, environmental sustainability, and then huge potential for the growth of green businesses here in the Western Cape along the supply chain. So I'm sorry I went a little bit longer than planned, but over to you again. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Always a great edification that you are able to give us, and on this platform, it's especially important. Just reminding the Western Cape as to how we're leading. And you mentioned the key word there, the magic word that the Western Cape government loves, innovation, and how we are innovating our way out of this, and the province is leading the way. Right, we've reached the stage of the Digicon where we will now open it up for questions. I've already received one question on WhatsApp from a member of the public. And it's a very simple one directed towards the professor, but you can keep those questions coming through in the chat box or WhatsApp or on the Premier social media platforms, and of course via email to me. Professor, the question reads, when we're talking about unbundling of Eskom, it's to me personally, it seems to have gone quite quiet, but I know there is quite a lot of stuff happening behind the scenes. What exactly does unbundling mean? How will that make Eskom more efficient? And does that mean Eskom, as we've known it for the past how many decades, will it cease to exist going forward with the country's new power generation capabilities?
So an important question. I mean, Eskom this year is 100 years old. It was established in 1923. But that business model of a dominant, vertically integrated state-owned utility is really now obsolete. I mean, 110 countries around the world have now restructured their electricity sectors, and they do that primarily for the reason that there's an understanding that generation is now competitive. You can have many players, but the grid is a natural monopoly. And so separating these two businesses is effectively what we're doing with unbundling. And so, as I said earlier, transmission and the system operation, the market operation functions will come out of Eskom. That's envisaged in the Electricity Regulation Act Amendment Bill, which has just been submitted to Parliament. And hopefully that will go through this year. We need to watch that quite carefully. And this is really an absolutely essential step to create a sustainable energy market going forward. For those reasons I said earlier, you need this fair, transparent platform for contracting private power, and you need to be able to get more investment into the transmission system. And Eskom doesn't have the ability to invest further because of its debt situation at the moment.
But it will still be part of our landscape.
Oh, and the grid is the heart of the system, right? So the grid is really what we want to save going forward. What happens to Eskom generation is still a policy question, but they don't have the ability to invest in new generation. That has to come from the private sector. And as these coal plants age, as we increasingly subject to issues around decarbonisation, Eskom's generation business will shrink over time while the private sector grows and we get more players into the market.
First, two more questions have come through for you. How constrained is the grid nationally and specifically in the Western Cape. So if we look at two separate pictures, but also generally, I mean, in real terms, how bad is it really? How constrained are we at the worst?
It's a big issue, and it's an issue which really confronts the Western Cape. I mean, the Western Cape is the best resource area for solar and wind combined, right? And it's the area, one of the provinces now that has one of the most immediate constraint on further capacity on the grid. There is some innovation happening there now, the way you can combine solar and wind at the same constrained transmission nodal point with some curtailment, which would allow more wind to come on the grid. But the big urgency is to get more investment into that grid. You know, we've heard a lot about this 8.5 billion rand Just Energy Transition Fund. It's puzzling to me that we haven't liberated the flow of those funds, because the perfect place for those funds to go to is strengthening the transmission grid to connect renewable energy.
Is that due to bureaucracy that we're not freeing up those funds? And
I think it's, you know, I've spoken to a lot of the international partners that have put up this fund, and they've expressed huge frustration that they're not getting the traction on the other side around projects to proceed with. We've also seen increasing suspicion from some quarters in government around what is the agenda of these international partners, that we shouldn't be bullied into decarbonisation. But in my view, these are funds that can be used in a very practical way, as I said, around strengthening the grid. That's not controversial and something that we should be proceeding with.
Professor, one more question. I think we are heading towards a point where we'll have to start wrapping up due to time constraints, but how worried should we be about the delays of bringing the Koeberg unit back online? There's already been a ridiculous delay that has got a lot of people worried, but generally it's how worried should we?
I think there's some big issues there. I understand there's a lot of disputes with the main contractor from Anton, and that needs to be managed well. We certainly need more transparency and reporting of what's happening there. It's absolutely essential that they stick to timelines now, because if they don't, they won't make that license renewal date, right? And if they don't get the new license, they won't be able to continue operating. So tracking what's happening there, I think, is very important. Yeah.
Great. And just one last question for you, Professor. What about the argument and what seems to be the national policy at this stage that we need coal for our base load generation? So it is going to be coal for a good while longer in South Africa. But what do you make of this argument?
Well, I mean, this last sentence that you just said is, I think, very important, right? I mean, coal is 85% of our generation mix, so 84%. It's some of those plants are going to be here for many, many years. So it's not as though we're transitioning overnight, but it's clear the path that we have to go. It is now very, very difficult to build and finance new coal power plant. So I think the realistic future scenario is that the existing fleet will be run down over time in a planned way, so that we add sufficient additional and new capacity, and not just renewables. I mean, we need to think a lot about gas. Gas needs more prominence. Again, a big issue of relevance to the Western Cape. You know, I don't know, there's not been much talk about the gas and oil finds just north of the Orange River off Namibia, but that's the same geology south of the border, and there are potentially massive gas resources there. So these are much more likely to be part of the future than building new coal.
All right, thank you. I think, as I mentioned earlier, we are running against time. We like to keep the Digicons as efficient as possible. So thank you for those questions. And thank you, Professor, for your insightful responses to those. We now hand over to Mr. Lester, Energy Advisor to the Premier and the Western Cape Government, for your useful fact of the week. Over to you, Mr. Lester.
Well, thank you very much, Regan. The tip is very much focused on residential customers. I sometimes know that we get tempted, especially on the paydays, to go and top up our electricity box. What I do want to say to you is that you must just check the volume at which you buy. These tariffs are set to send a pricing signal. So the higher volume you buy in terms of one purchase, at some particular point, the price per unit will change and it will increase. And the idea there is the pricing signal is that they don't want you to use more energy than is actually required. So when you are topping up, stay within that limit where you're paying potentially the best cost per unit. As soon as you start to increase that volume significantly, you will find that the price of those units go up, and you'll be asking yourself, well, why do I get less units and I'm spending more money? It is very much an inclined tariff that is being applied. So at a particular point, that price will increase. So top up for what you need. Don't buy too much because you're actually going to be paying a premium. Thank you, Regan.
Thank you very much. I'm then going to close this Digicon. So first of all, can I say, Prof, thank you very much for joining us. And again, really, your slides make so much sense and really give us such clarity on what needs to be done. As I said earlier, we've got a lot to do and we've got a long journey. Also to Mr. Lester, to Regan, to you, thank you very much. To the technical team here that keep us connected. Thank you very much to all of you. And then most of all, to all of you who've logged on, the media and citizens of the Western Cape. Thanks for joining us. I hope these are useful. Keep those questions coming because they will also influence on what future Digicon's content will be like going forward. But thanks very much and enjoy your day.